This video is sponsored by Skillshare.
This video is protected by fair use. In fact, if you wish to get the full context of this story, I suggest that you visit the Joe Budden podcast on YouTube and Patreon and enjoy the episodes in their entirety. Thank you. And Joe, if you're watching this, please don't strike this video down.
All right, go!
No Joe Budden. No Rory and Mal.
This Parks. Microphone check 1, 2. What is this?
No Joe Budden. No Rory and Mal.
Parks on the boards. Yes!
Microphone check 1, 2, what is this? I'm your bold, brash and balding host, Trap Lord Joe, and in today's podcast we're going to be recapping the entire history of what was once hip-hop's most exciting podcast that went on a rocket ship ride to the very top in a tale that would give the social network a run for its money. This is the story of 3 hip-hop loving guys who one day decided to record their conversations about the rap game and eventually found themselves as the #1 podcast on Spotify for 2019. Going on to turn down deals that were rumored to be in the tens of millions of dollars, all in the pursuit of building something bigger and owning it all. However, much like we've seen with other billion-dollar businesses that are built from the ground up, as the numbers got bigger, so too did the egos involved. In this case, everybody waited far too long to determine who actually owned what, and with tension between the main cast members and Joe Budden himself going rogue on key business decisions, eventually the podcast descended into an awkward and tense atmosphere, leading to one of the messiest and nastiest breakups in podcast history. And ever since the collapse of the original podcast team and the bitter departure of co-hosts Rory and Mal from the Joe Budden podcast, everybody has been asking what really happened. How could hip-hop's 3 amigos of podcasting be truly broken up for good? And yes, I know the question a lot of you have been asking, is this just Joe Budden sabotaging his career once again, as he always seems to do whenever he has something good going on? Well, today we're going to recap the entire story of the Joe Budden podcast, Joe's origin story of how he got screwed over by the record industry when he was a rapper, his rebirth as a podcaster looking at the people who helped him get his start, how he treated those people who helped him at the start, all the way up to Joe becoming the podcast king with fans lined up around the block to see him rock the mic as a podcaster instead of a rapper. With all of this culminating in a spectacular blowout where, despite screaming the importance of ownership for years at his co-hosts, it would turn out that after appearing in over 300 episodes with Joe, they owned nothing. Some of you might be diehard fans of the Joe Budden podcast who just don't know this whole story from the start, or maybe this is the very first time that you've even heard of Joe Budden. But either way you look at it, today we are going deep to uncover and explain once and for all exactly what went wrong with the Joe Budden podcast. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Check out my skills, I got them from Skillshare. They keep it real, yeah. Find a new passion or improve an old one if it's still there. Skillshare's got thousands of courses. Find something to learn cause it never gets boring. If you're creative, then Skillshare's the greatest. Join now and see what the community's saying. If you've ever been down cause your skills aren't sharp, stop being a clown. Join Skillshare right now. Get a new talent and make all the haters say wow. Just sit back, learn and watch. Skillshare will help you a lot. If you're down bad and lost your job, just grab a new skill, soon you'll be the boss. If you're a creative woman or man, but you struggle with your time and making a plan, try out this course from Thomas Frank on building a system that's super dank. Productivity for creatives will help artists be their greatest. Get more from your time and cut wastage. Sharpen your mindset and then you might make it. It's a fire course that will help you progress. If you want to level up, then Skillshare is the best. And there's no adverts selling you stuff, so you know Skillshare is the one. Gang, click that link in description, sign up for Skillshare Premium membership, and the first 1,000 people who click will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare Premium membership, so you can start exploring your creativity today.
Now, if you want to know more specific details on Joe Budden's career as a rapper, then I suggest you go and watch my earlier video on how Jay-Z sabotaged Joe Budden's career. Because in many ways, what happened to Joe Budden at Def Jam Records was essentially Joe's origin story in the hero's tale of him starting the #1 podcast on Spotify. But depending on how you look at it, in many ways, Joe is more of a villain than a hero when it came to doing business with his friends. Anywho, the short recap on Joe Budden's career as a rapper. He'd been dropping music as early as 1999, eventually landing appearances on early mixtapes mixtapes by Breakfast Club stooge DJ Envy. From here, Joe eventually attracted the attention of prestigious Def Jam Records, who signed him to a deal and moving forward supported his first single, Focus. This track did okay, but it was followed up by Joe's smash hit, Pump, Pump, Pump It Up. This radio-friendly party anthem was an instant hit for Joe and shot him right to the top of the rap game. The track was Grammy nominated for Best Male Solo Performance. It went number 38 on the Billboard charts. It ended up on the Too Fast, Too Furious soundtrack, and it was a certified international hit. Hell, I was about 10 years old when this song dropped, and all the way in little old Bognor Regis in the south of England was I hearing Pump It Up getting spun on Radio 1 regularly by legendary British hip-hop DJ The Big Dog Tim Westwood.
That was Tim Westwood exclusive right there.
So Joe's hit record Pump It Up lived on his debut album, the self-titled Joe Budden. And with everything Joe Budden touched turning to a W around this time, it would be hard to imagine everything going left for this young hip-hop prospect. But just as quick as Joe got to the top, things would soon come crumbling down. Now again, if you want all the gritty detail on how Joe's career fell apart, go and watch my video on his beef with Jay-Z. But basically, Joe tried to get Jay-Z on the Pump It Up remix. Jay-Z asked for a very large payment to be on the track. Joe took offense to this and said no, and told Jay-Z that he couldn't use his beat. Jay-Z then went ahead and used that beat, dropping his own remix to Pump It Up, dissing Joe Budden. Within a year or so of all of this going down, Jay-Z ended up becoming the president of Def Jam Records. And in Joe's opinion, during his tenure at the head of Def Jam Records, Jay-Z began to swing his power around in order to sabotage Joe Budden's career, with Joe suggesting that as president of the company, Jay-Z made sure that the lion's share of the label's resources and support were going towards Jay-Z projects, not Joe Budden. And eventually Joe found out that he had indeed been dropped by Def Jam, only discovering his shafting after he read about it on a blog like everyone else.
I woke up and read on the internet that I was dropped from Def Jam. That's pretty simple. And my heart started beating fast, like.
Joe actually claimed to be happy to be off the label after the way that he'd been treated, saying simply they just weren't letting him release any music.
I was on Def Jam, I put one album out and they wouldn't put any more of my music out.
Thankfully, Joe Budden was able to rebuild his career after the Def Jam debacle. So, following Joe's disastrous Def Jam deal crumbling to pieces, he decided to move forward with his career and sign with a smaller company. And over the years that followed, Joe would drop numerous smaller independent projects digitally to mixed success. In fact, Joe would even later say that this record label that he signed with after Def Jam actually duped him into owing them a whole bunch more albums than he had initially anticipated, which kind of sapped his enjoyment of rapping in general.
And they gave me a contract, and it was one sheet, 2 paragraphs, we'll give you this amount of money, you give us that, and that's it, it's a wash. 100 grand?
100 grand.
75 grand, somewhere around there. Then I learned that one sheet that I signed, that one sheet was then plastered to like 90 other sheets, and a new contract was created that said I owed more albums.
At this point, Joe slowed down on recording because he couldn't get out of his contract, though eventually, a little while later, that contract ended up getting sold to E1, who negotiated with Joe and convinced him to start recording again. Joe also spent some time recording with his rap crew Slaughterhouse under Shady Records, but eventually that arrangement went left too, and Joe found himself feuding with Eminem, the head honcho of Shady Records too. Now, we could talk all day about people that Joe Budden has fallen out with, and who specifically is the person to blame, Joe Budden. But let's just say, Joe's music career was littered with fallouts and collapsed relationships. Whoever is to blame for those, you decide, Joe Budden. But anywho, with all of these career L's and the rap game stacking up, it's no wonder that at a certain point Joe Budden got completely disgruntled with music, deciding to take on a new approach and give broadcasting a go. In fact, Joe Budden had even had a successful radio career early in the game at the same time he was killing it as a rapper, with Joe even saying that he got offered $250,000 a year to host on Hot 97 before his rapping had even taken off.
I did the Hot 97 morning show in 2004. So yeah, she was saying radio, but I heard steady check.
What was the check?
It was $250 a year.
$250,000 a year.
Well, it turned out that the record label didn't like this rapper moonlighting as a radio host, so they forced him to pick one or the other, and Joe actually ended up leaving his role on the radio show. Joe said in a statement at the time that he was leaving because he needed to focus on his album. It's funny because he probably didn't realize it at the time, but this was probably a huge mistake. I mean, it's kind of ironic. Had Joe Budden just stayed where he was, he probably could have saved himself 10 years of hustle and become Charlemagne before Charlemagne was even Charlemagne. But anywho, Joe Budden decided to leave broadcasting behind in 2004 and get straight to being a abused and violated by the rap game like a rat on his first night at Rikers. But even way back in the day while he was still rapping, Joe was showing everyone that he was still head and shoulders above the competition. Now, I don't want to give Joe Budden's ego any more inflating than it's already had, but in many ways, Joe Budden has more in common with early technology pioneers like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg than he does with Jay-Z or Royce da 5'9". Joe was incredibly early to using technology to promote his music and his personal brand. In fact, if you go to his YouTube channel now, the Joe Budden TV channel where all of his podcasts are still uploaded, and you sort his videos by oldest, you'll see mini promo clips, vlogs, and music videos dating all the way back to 2007. Joe's been on this YouTube self-promotion journey way before most of these rappers. Though for the record, I just want to say Joe Budden's first upload on YouTube was a whopping year and a half after Big Soulja Boy's first upload, but that guy's a freaking time traveler. Anywho, even though he was uploading early, Joe Budden's view counts were never really giving Jake Paul the run for their money. But Joe Budden's well-populated YouTube channel would become the future home to many of his creative projects. Whether it was a vlog, Vine, freestyle, music video, any idea from the brain of Joe Budden could be broadcast to the world without interference from any record labels or executives, directly using his YouTube channel. Joe, without realizing it all the way back then, had discovered the true power of having an independent place that he owned to broadcast his voice into the world. But all he was missing at this point was the perfect format to showcase his exuberant personality. And in 2015, he would finally find that format, in the form of podcasting. Disgruntled with the rap game and looking for a new outlet to broadcast his voice to the world, in February 2015, Joe Budden dusted off his microphone, shined up his head, and pressed record on his very first podcast venture. Joe Budden's first episode of his first ever podcast, released under the tongue-in-cheek name I'll Name This Podcast Later. And in the beginning, the podcast was audio only, and the very first voice that we heard on the podcast wasn't Joe's, but actually that of Peter Rosenberg, Hot 97 DJ, who actually helped Joe Budden find a free space to record his podcast from, and engineered early episodes in an attempt to help Joe get on. Remember that for later, because Joe won't. Anyway, after Rosenberg's little introduction, we then hear a theme song. Joe Budden actually used the instrumental for Mobb Deep's Shook Ones Part 2 as the intro to his podcast, one of the most classic and iconic hip-hop beats in history, which maybe the less rap literate amongst us might remember as the beat that was actually used in the final battle scene of 8 Mile. This set the audience up to know that from the very start that this podcast is going to be straight bars for anybody that loves real hip-hop, aka old heads. Now, I know that Joe today sees himself as this big media mogul that's all about ownership, but I'd just like to point out how stupid it is that all the early episodes of his podcast start out with an intro song that Joe doesn't even own, so all of his early episodes of the podcast are actually copyright claimed and he's probably not earning any money from them. But hell, Havoc from Mobb Deep and Prodigy's estate are probably getting a tidy little bag from all that watch time. Anyway, in this very first episode, Joe Budden is joined by fellow Hot 97 host Marisa Mendez, and in my opinion, the show was straight fire from the very start. Joe was clearly a skilled broadcaster from episode 1, and he knew how to hold an interesting and entertaining conversation from the word go. And you can immediately see Joe's potential as a podcast master, regardless of who he was sitting alongside. Initially, there was no Rory and Mal to be seen on the podcast. However, they were introduced in name as early as episode 2 when Joe Budden actually mentioned Rory and Mal, and you could tell from the word go that Joe basically had no respect for these dudes.
It's like Mal, my friend Mal. Mal is great. I don't know where Mal is or what he's doing.
Where has he been lately?
I don't know, but then I don't really care about what he's doing. This has been the topic amongst my friends. Not even my friends, really just Rory, my fucking stupid young friend.
10-year-old Rory.
Yeah, Rory's like 12.
Eventually, we would get to meet Joe's stupid young friend, as Rory's first appearance on I'll Name This Podcast Later came in episode 7.
We have a special co-host today, Rory. For some reason, he's co-hosting. I have no idea why he's in here.
This wasn't planned. I just happened to be sitting in the chair.
And what begun as an impromptu appearance from a friend soon developed into a full-blown co-hosting position, with Joe saying in episode 14 that he assumes Rory is now a co-host because he just keeps showing up.
With my co-hosts, I'm assuming Rory is a co-host now because he just keeps coming. Rory.
Stop sending me the address.
Careful, Joe, you know Rory can't be trusted with addresses. Anywho, the then unnamed podcast continued on for around 60 or so episodes without incident, with Joe, Rory, and Marisa shooting the shit, entertaining the fans, and slowly building this nameless podcast into something special and significant. However, it wouldn't take long for Joe, the drama magnet, to end up clashing with one of his co-hosts. And soon Joe would end up in a feud with both engineer Rosenberg and co-host Marisa, resulting in her abrupt firing from the show and a messy falling out on the air. Now, Joe's first experience of firing a co-host savagely would come when the episode count had reached its 70s. Now, this was actually also around the same time that Joe was beefing with Drake, releasing numerous diss songs and regularly discussing Drake on the podcast. Now, I won't get too into the Joe-Drake beef here, but I did do an entire video breaking down that beef. Go check that out if you haven't. Anywho, whilst this beef between Joe and Drake was going on, the most poppin' hip-hop radio stations in New York, Hot 97 and Power 105, were having a little radio beef going on, with Old Man Ebro, Peter Rosenberg and Marisa Mendez, who also co-hosted the podcast with Joe Budden, on the Hot 97 side of the beef, feuding with the other side on Power 105, fronted by Charlemagne the God, DJ Envy and Angela Yee, and also in the mix of this feud was Andrew Schulz, who co-hosts the Brilliant Idiots podcast with Charlemagne. Now, once again, the feud between Hot 97 and Power 105 is long and complex, but hell, if you want me to do a video on that, head over to Instagram at TraplawRoss, drop me a follow and drop me a DM, letting me know that you want to see Hot 97 versus Power 105, and hell, maybe I'll do it. Anywho, this is where the beef begun to spill from the Hot 97 side into the Joe Budden podcast. Because episode 3 of I'll Name This Podcast Later ended up being a crossover episode with Joe and Rory linking up with the Brilliant Idiots podcast that Charlemagne the God and Andrew Schulz. Now, apparently Joe Budden and Rory's regular podcast co-host Marisa Mendez from Hot 97 was simply not invited to join in on this joint podcast between Joe and Rory and Charlemagne and Andrew Schulz. And as a result, Peter Rosenberg from Hot 97 didn't take too kindly to Joe and Rory showing so much love to his ops. Apparently Rosenberg was particularly butthurt by this, considering the fact that he had engineered early episodes of Joe's podcast and helped him find a free studio to record the first episodes of the podcast in. So, pissed off with Joe Budden's snaky maneuvers, Peter Rosenberg took to the airwaves live to diss Joe, airing out their private dispute which had apparently sparked off when Joe Budden had asked Rosenberg to produce the podcast full-time, something which he didn't want to do.
You're a podcaster trying to rap. You're a podcaster trying to rap. No one cares. So I'm gonna make fun of him. He's a great rapper, but no one cares. I don't like Joe Budden anymore. I'm not calling him my guy anymore either. No, it's not my guy. You done with Joe? Yes. I produce his podcast. Treats me like crap. I helped him get started. I guess he thought I was going to be a super producer and be there every day, so treat him like garbage.
And after that, Rosenberg went even further, revealing that Joe had planned to start a podcast with Charlemagne, which he allegedly didn't want Marisa to be part of.
Just found out he is doing a joint podcast with Charlemagne. Didn't tell or mention his co-host, Marisa Mendez, who works here for us, just announced it, and she wasn't invited to participate. And I was like, word? That's just how you move with your people?
In response to this on-air outburst from the Hot 97 side of things, Joe formally removed Marisa from his podcast, apparently firing her by text message. And from there, Marisa did not appear on Joe's podcast ever again. After the crossover episode with the Brilliant Idiots podcast, episode 74 dropped featuring Joe and Rory, and ironically Ice of Ish and Ice fame, who we now know would later come back on the show once again to replace Rory. Ice is like the Grim Reaper of Joe Budden podcast guests. Anyway, to his credit, allegedly Rory had actually tried to pattern up the relationship between Joe and Marisa, but this was sadly unsuccessful.
And so then the next day, Rory calls me like, yo, y'all gotta talk. We gotta get this sorted out. I'm like, I still don't know what the fuck happened. But to be honest with you, I don't even want to talk.
In the end, the two sides could not reconcile and Joe moved forward with the podcast without Marisa and never looked back. And apparently Joe hadn't and wasn't going to mention the firing of Marisa on his show. But then in August of 2017, Joe was confronted by Marisa and Rosenberg live on Hot 97 when he visited the radio station to promote his last musical project, Rage and the Machine, with the Hot 97 crew confronting Joe about these personal issues in what I believe was a very unprofessional and embarrassing scene.
Why'd you kick her off the podcast?
I did not kick her off of the podcast.
I get a text message. You don't even call me and talk to me about it?
No, it was nothing to talk about. I'm 36. What the fuck do I owe you? What are you talking about?
So you was gonna let it fly and just let it be quiet?
Yeah. 100%. Because if I were to address it, I wouldn't have anything good to say.
Joe didn't really have much to say about the firing, and eventually he walked out of the interview because, as he said, he was only there to promote his music project. But since he'd now been dragged and embarrassed publicly over the firing of a co-host, Joe decided, next podcast episode, why not address it? So he did on episode 76.
Long story short, I let go of Marisa and I thought that I addressed it here very well by not really addressing it because I care about her. Then they invited me to do the morning show at Hot 97, which I did not want to do.
So, with Marisa out of the picture and a healthy dose of added clout from the circus that Hot 97 created after her firing, Joe had a hot podcast with an open seat ready for a new co-host to join. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is where Mealy Mal enters the picture. It was episode 77 of I'll Name This Podcast Later when Joe Budden introduced his new podcast host, his old pal Mal.
Mal has spent a lot of time with me.
Now apparently, Joe, Mal, and Marisa all used to live together in a big old house in Jersey way back in like 2011.
Like Mal, we all used to live together in 2011. Joey had this big ass crib in Jersey. It was me, him, Mal, bunch of random girls. Like, we had the fucking time of our lives.
Joe explained in his own words the value that Mal was bringing to the podcast. An ability to condense down a street perspective in a simple way that Joe could understand.
Mal puts those things in ebonics, in very hood terms, for me. Like, no, Joe, you don't need to put on your fucking Christmas LeBrons and run through the woods because the cops are here for a noise complaint.
Mal's Wikipedia for the hood.
So the rapport was truly real between this newly formed trio. And as the new updated formula for the still unnamed podcast flourished, episodes continued to drop and fans continued to enjoy the work. And from here, with every drop, the podcast would continue to blow up, iterating forward and getting better with each episode. Once they got to episode 92, they even brought the cameras in so that they could release a visual version of the podcast on YouTube. And despite Joe Budden saying about 107 times that I'll Name This Podcast Later is the real name of the podcast, it would turn out that episode 107 was indeed the final episode of I'll Name This Podcast Later. Because from episode 108, the show would be renamed the Joe Budden Podcast. But rather than starting all over again from episode 1 of the Joe Budden Podcast, of course, they just continued forward with the numbers as they were.
We are rebranding.
Now, let's just take a step back and just imagine the ego trip that Joe Budden must have been on to rename his podcast 107 episodes in, already successful, the Joe Budden Podcast. I mean, it makes sense. You know, most people are there for him and his takes. He is the biggest star on the podcast. It's his podcast. But the name before was kind of funny. I'll Name This Podcast Later. It was kind of cool. I don't think it would have held him back. But the thing is, apparently, there was more going on under the surface relating to Joe's reasoning for this rebrand. Now, I'm not sure if this is how Joe genuinely felt, or if this is just the story that he was spinning to convince his clueless co-hosts that the name change was a good idea. Because apparently, the rename of the podcast to the Joe Budden Podcast was administered under the guise of securing a large brand deal. And even at the time, when it was explained that way, Rory and Mal seemed super excited about making the name change because they thought that they were gonna get a big brand deal for their part in the Joe Budden Podcast.
We sold out.
We did. We totally did. So? And when I talked to my immediate circle, they were all like, nah, that name was amazing. And I was like, nope, gotta rebrand. We're here for the bigger picture, guys.
I'm here for the bag.
We want to continue to do this podcast.
I will call this shit anything for the bag.
We'll call it the bag.
The fucking
the
bag.
The bag podcast.
I mean, I can barely swallow the irony that Joe finessed these suckers into letting him rename the podcast, already had quite a good name, into the Joe Budden Podcast, under the pretense that they would earn more money if the podcast was renamed after one of the people on the podcast. Joe convinced them that they would earn more money if the podcast was named after him. I mean... But the Cosmic Hells don't stop there, people. Because in episode 109, Joe even commented on the backlash about renaming the podcast, explaining once again that his name had only been put in the title of the pod with the intention of securing the biggest bag possible.
Why is that stupid?
Why is the podcast not called For the Bag? Because why would it be...
that's stupid.
Yeah, the bag would shrink.
So with the metaphorical bag secured, or at least that's what Joe told his co-hosts, and with Joe's literal name above the door, it was time to get to work. But it wouldn't take long for Joe's podcast co-hosts to find themselves feuding with other presenters and broadcasters in the space. At this point, tension was brewing behind the scenes, and it all had something to do with fellow hip-hop media personality and mogul, a Mr. DJ Academics. The Bag Podcast, episode 111, begun with the guys reacting to Andrew Schulz, pointing out some friction between Joe and Academics and Joe and Rory.
I'm concerned about that show for one reason. I've seen some infighting taken to the Twitter streets.
Uh-oh. With Academics and Joe Budden?
Academics Joe, and then also Rory. You know, Rory's doing some tweets about how Joe's taking all his talking points and using them.
Drop that flex
the
bomb.
Academics like, oh, they're making edits.
Now, I couldn't find the deleted tweets in question, but basically what it seemed to suggest was that Rory was salty about talking points from the Joe Budden Podcast, making it into Joe's other show, Everyday Struggle, that he appeared on with DJ Academics on Complex. Now, in case you didn't know, Everyday Struggle was a highly entertaining show where Joe Budden and DJ Academics would passionately debate the hot hip-hop topics of the day, usually resulting in Joe Budden blowing a gasket and yelling/walking off the set with hilarious consequences. Everyday Struggle was an iconic moment in hip-hop broadcasting that truly set a new gold standard for full-length shows discussing the hip-hop culture. And all of this was way back in May 2017. So hey, maybe Rory felt like Everyday Struggle was cribbing from the Joe Budden podcast, or maybe he simply felt threatened by the fact that Joe had another bigger show on another platform with DJ Academics. And so it's around this time that Rory basically cements his public position as basically being anti-DJ Academics and anti-Everyday Struggle, with Rory proceeding to make numerous sideswipes at Academics on Joe's podcast.
I don't know.
They just keep putting everybody in front of me that I don't fucking want to talk to.
Like Academics.
So, tension is brewing in these streets between Rory and DJ Academics. Meanwhile, another beef is brewing between Rory and Andrew Schulz from the Brilliant Idiots podcast, with the tension stemming from comments that Andrew Schulz and Charlemagne made on their podcast, where they suggested that Everyday Struggle would soon collapse, and basically clowning Rory and Mal for letting Joe Budden rename the podcast after himself.
Yeah, we think the show's gonna be done in a month.
Yeah.
I think that
I give Everyday Struggle about 6 months. Yeah, and Rory and Mal, y'all out of y'all goddamn mind to let him name the podcast the Joe Budden podcast. All right.
The real implication of all of this was that Schulz and Charlemagne basically thought that when Everyday Struggle falls apart, Academics would replace Rory and Mal. Comments which, if you ask me, are more of a sideswipe at Joe Budden's personality, how he has a reputation of being unstable and disloyal, rather than trying to put down Rory or Mal or whatever their contributions are to the podcast. But regardless, this podcasting rivalry actually triggered Rory into making several misguided comments towards Andrew Schulz, basically saying fuck him and that he could beat him in a fight.
Fuck Brilliant.
Andrew's tall.
He is tall.
Yeah.
I would love to see you and Andrew slap
That don't really mean shit.
But that wouldn't be the first time Rory would suggest that he could take somebody in a fight on the air either. And funnily enough, the same day that podcast dropped with Rory dissing Andrew Schulz, Andrew and Charlemagne actually invited Academics onto the Brilliant Idiots, where they discussed Joe, Everyday Struggle, and Rory and Mal. This had a lot of moments that were interpreted by Joe and his team as dropping shade on Joe, sneak dissing him as part of a strategy, which Joe, Rory, and Mal interpreted as an attempt to divide and conquer the Everyday Struggle duo of Joe Budden and Academics, basically trying to turn Joe and Ac against each other, and making fun of Joe Budden never letting Academics talk on their show.
You know, Academics, I want you to feel comfortable.
I'm always comfortable.
Enough to talk. You know, I know you don't get to talk on Everyday Struggle. You know what I'm saying? I want the record to show if Academics was having this conversation with Joe Budden would have said, shut the f*** up. You do not listen to Nas.
During this podcast, Andrew Schulz and Charlemagne repeated their prediction that Everyday Struggle wouldn't last several times.
It wasn't, hey, I said that Everyday Struggle was going to last 6 months.
I said 2.
And the reason, and it has nothing to do with you and everything to do with self-destructive Joe Budden.
Yeah.
Like I just said, Joe Budden is the guy who, when things get good, he fucking puts gas all over the place, lights a cigarette, and blows the joint. I think we might name this the Joe Budden podcast.
Joe Budden podcast? or we'll name this podcast later.
Now, this podcast, with Academics appearing on the Brilliant Idiots, was followed up by a tense crossover episode with the Joe Budden podcast. In episode 113, Charlemagne dropped by without Andrew Schulz, in an episode that opened up with Joe Budden playing the Eye of the Tiger from Rocky, letting everybody know that this episode was finna be a fight, and with Charlemagne ready to straight up stiff arm Rory on the mic.
Black privilege and white privilege right next to each other.
There you go. But black privilege is different. I just feel like it's a privilege to be black. You just, you know.
I was just born.
Now, part of the reason Charlemagne was even there on Joe Budden's podcast was to settle a Twitter beef that he was having with Joe Budden personally at the time, because Joe Budden had dissed L.A. Reid for an abuse scandal, and Charlemagne had called Joe Budden a hypocrite because he's got his own dodgy past and maybe shouldn't be dissing L.A. Reid like that. But in my opinion, the real value of Charlemagne's appearance on this podcast was everything he did to spit facts and hard truths at Joe's sidekick stooge Rory. In fact, Charlemagne had so much foresight and amazing wisdom from the future that he was basically Charladamus in this episode, spitting hella facts about the future of the podcast that would be relevant later on, but at the time went straight over the head of young Rory. Charlemagne immediately said that Rory and Mal had been finessed by letting Joe Budden rename the podcast after himself. A comment to which, funnily enough, Rory just wanted to make everything be about Academics.
I still think it should be our name this podcast later. I don't know why y'all let him change it to the Joe Budden podcast. I thought y'all was
Your little academic tactic won't work here.
But I'm just saying.
Then Joe started saying that he had a better white co-host than Charlemagne, leading Charlemagne to take a fat old dookie in Rory's stupid face.
I think I have a better white co-host than you.
Oh, nah, Andrew washes Rory.
At what?
I don't think
He's
so.
funnier, smarter.
What?
This is biased as shit. It's the truth, though. And I like Rory.
I might be a bit wittier.
Yeah, this one really got me, right? Rory said that he was wittier than Andrew Schulz. You know, Andrew Schulz, who has a Wikipedia page that lists him as a stand-up comedian. What does Rory's Wikipedia page list him as? Oh, he doesn't have one. Tell you what, Rory, when you get a Wikipedia page, maybe go jump on there and put in that you're witty so we can believe you. Citation needed. Anyway, in my opinion, this moment was a really bad look for Rory. And it's possible that he had just spent far too much time sitting next to Joe Budden and some of that ego rubbed off on him, because Rory really was out here with himself convinced that he was wittier and more talented than Andrew Schulz. Sucker. Anyway, Rory then continued to drag academics into this beef by accusing Charlemagne of bringing academics onto his show for the pure purpose of dividing and conquering the relationship between Joe and academics to, in his words, undermine the competition.
He's trying to divide and conquer the same way he did by getting Ack on his podcast.
We're gonna talk.
Us.
I can't wait to talk about
What?
I think you brought Ack on there to separate Ack and Joe against your competition.
Now, to me, this makes no sense and really just kind of exposes the fact that Rory just had such an intense dislike and frankly paranoia around Joe Budden's relationship with academics that it really seemed like he could only see things through the lens of DJ Academics just trying to destroy him. Ack never cared about you, Rory. Anyway, Charlemagne defended himself well against these suggestions, reminding Rory that he has his own long-storied relationship with academics.
Rory, do you know how long I've known academics? I know academics for all of y'all motherfuckers. I've been giving academics advice and mentoring him for at least 5 to 6 years.
Well, why did you choose this time then?
Yeah, not everything's about you, Rory. Charlemagne went on to say point blank that at his podcast network, they have a sweepstakes on how long it's going to take Joe Budden to self-destruct and collapse everything that he has going for him and lose his slot on Everyday Struggle.
It's a nice little pool at Loudspeaker. Like, how long before Joe Budden fucks up Everyday Struggle?
Wait, there's a pool at Loudspeaker?
Andrew got 2 months. I'm giving you 6 months, Joe.
Well, it turned out that Charlemagne was dead right. And not just about Joe leaving Everyday Struggle, but this podcast dropped in May 2017. And exactly 6 months later, in December 2017, it was revealed that Joe and Everyday Struggle had parted ways. Honestly, I'm convinced that Charlemagne has psychic rap media powers at this point. Charlemagne, where am I going to be in 10 years? In fact, don't answer that, as he definitely wouldn't have anything good to say about me. Anyway, at one point, Rory confronts Charlemagne about him saying that Rory was salty about academics. He was.
Academics.
I think you got a little hate towards academics.
You might be right,
Rory, because I think you know that he's going to take your spot eventually. Joe's got to do his best for his brand.
Wait, you think
Joe's got to do his best for his brand.
And at this point, psychic Charlemagne looks deep into his crystal ball, oh wait, that's Joe Budden's head, and tells Rory exactly what's going to happen next. Maybe he was wrong about Ack taking Rory's spot, but Charlemagne looks 4 years into the future and perfectly predicts that Joe would sling Rory to the curb with zero loyalty.
I feel like Joe is loyal to his friends.
Okay, so
the guys
Joe and
he meets through the industry, y'all kind of disposable.
Hell, even Joe Budden himself can't help but chime in, saying jokingly that the firing of Rory is coming.
I'd rather him replace me if I was whack on this podcast or people didn't want me on.
Well, that's coming.
You're not.
Well, that's coming. Well, that's coming.
Joe went on to discuss his firing of Marisa, saying to Rory straight up that he does not tolerate insubordination.
He's the
I couldn't wait to fire Marisa.
Thank you, I appreciate that. See, you heard what he just said? And you wonder why I think Everyday Struggle won.
Before Academics did your podcast, I told him, if I hear something I do not like, I'm getting you fired. I'm not with insubordination or people interrupting the fucking plan and the journey. You know Marisa had to go. Don't do that.
I didn't even say anything.
So look, Rory had all of the warning that he needed to know that Joe Budden will cut you loose at any second. But he was too stubborn to heed the warnings and the advice that he was given at the time. And just as Charlemagne had predicted, in 6 months' time, Joe's position on Everyday Struggle would collapse too, and the public fallout that followed would affect everybody around him. Now, after the explosive episode with Charlemagne on the podcast, the dust settled and each respective side got back to podcasting and kept it moving. But drama would come knocking in December, when Joe Budden left Everyday Struggle in a blaze of glory. Exactly when Charlemagne said he would. Now, long story short, Joe Budden learned a few things were going on behind the scenes at Complex. He learned they were making a huge bag from sponsors on the show that he had created, including a lucrative deal with Spotify.
Complex solicits rather large checks.
Do they share with the creators?
No.
Now, this came along with the fact that Joe was expected to do more work than was in his contract for no additional pay so that Complex could get the bag from Spotify. Essentially, Complex were taking advantage of Joe to get that bag.
I cannot create a show and you sell the properties of that show without cutting a slice to the niggas that make that show possible.
Now, you already know my thoughts on Complex. If you watch my video reacting to their article trashing me over on my second channel, Trap Moros. But anywho, the chumps over at Complex let Joe's contract expire without renewal, giving him one final slap in the face, offering him to return to the show at a heavily reduced freelance rate.
Newly expired contract is indeed expired. We have moved on. If Joe is to come to work, that would be awesome, but he'll accept this rate of pennies and biscuits.
Now, this isn't a video about the fall of Everyday Struggle, but at the very least, the collapse of Everyday Struggle spawned a lot of explosive podcast content. Episode 141 of the Joe Budden podcast saw Joe reacting to the Everyday Struggle firing. That episode actually came along with a heavy dose of irony as Joe and Rory discussed their experiences in unemployment, which was mwah.
I got fired. Rory is really excited about that.
No, I'm here to console you, man. Rory did that, so hopefully you won't have to go through that. I help you with your resume. I know people, I got connections, man.
Joe also said during this discussion that contracts mean nothing to him, comments which would echo later on in this beef.
A contract means nothing to me. Follow me?
I'm on board.
Joe later addressed his falling out with Complex further in an appearance on The Breakfast Club, saying that he stuck it out for the duration of his contract, even after finding out that he had been finessed because he had a vision of where he was going.
I want to quit. I want to go in here and tell all these people suck my dick, but there's a greater cause.
Charlemagne echoed his earlier comments, saying Joe had high value as a host, but low value when it came to being unreliable and super easy to fall out with people.
It's like, yeah, you know your value's high, but how long is Joe Budden going to want to be here in this situation?
Well, if anybody that knows Joe Budden history, I have no problem exiting.
That's the problem.
That summed it up perfectly. Joe Budden is a high-value individual anywhere he goes because he's always going to be entertaining. But as everyone knows, he's an abrasive personality who has an uncontrollable habit of falling out with people. But this didn't seem to stop Joe from cutting deals and getting W's going forward. As well as already lucrative deals for his appearances on the reality show Love and Hip Hop, Joe would go on to sign a deal with P. Diddy's Revolt network to launch his new show, State of the Culture, as well as having major success with his own solo interview series Pull Up, heavily supported by Cash App. In fact, in Joe's words later on, it was raining M's for him at this point in his career.
It was raining M's. M from Viacom. M from Revolt, M from over here, M from over there.
But the crown jewel in Joe's business portfolio was still his self-titled podcast. And it was in August 2018 that Joe Budden would finally sign a landmark deal with Spotify. A deal which would begin as a massive success, and you guessed it, in true Joe Budden fashion, would eventually crumble into a pile of embarrassing drama. In August 2018, Joe Budden signed a deal with Spotify to bring the audio from the Joe Budden podcast to their platform exclusively, with a commitment to dropping 2 episodes per week. Joe Budden released a full statement on his Spotify deal, saying, "I'd like to thank Spotify." Sorry, I'm not going to do his voice. "I'd like to thank Spotify for this tremendous opportunity to take the Joe Budden podcast and podcasting in general to heights never before seen. Our partnership is extremely humbling for me and adds yet another chapter to a career full of plot twists. This highlights a new way of thinking and a corporate head nod to the shift taking place before our very eyes. I'm even more thrilled to embark on this journey with some of my closest friends and people I love. The podcast has been a great amplifier for my voice, but fast growing into a platform for more and more artists to share their personal feelings, stories, and experiences. I'm anxious to get started and optimistic about what's to come. While companies are spending endless amounts of dollars and research to find out what consumers want, how they want it, and who they want it from, we're in a space where all you have to do is listen to the people. Again, thank you Spotify for listening." And Joe announced the Spotify deal at the end of his podcast episode number 175, saying to his 2 co-hosts Rory and Mal, "We did it.
We did it!
We did it.
We did it.
We are the champions.
Audio exclusive on Spotify only."
At this point, people in the comments were congratulating Joe Budden on pulling off the best hip-hop rebrand of all time. And they were right. I mean, in some ways, Joe had failed as a rapper. I mean, anyone that made a living rapping, racked up multiple plaques and hits, and could just pay the bills from rapping is a cosmic W in my book. But reborn as a podcast host, Joe Budden had another shot at the very top. And as a media mogul, Joe Budden was basically having another pump it up moment. But of course, it wasn't just the prestige of being a hot commodity in the broadcasting space that had Joe Budden excited. It was that juicy bag too. Because Joe said himself he had been trying to get a bag for the podcast for ages.
And I've been trying to get us a bag for this fucking podcast for years, man.
In fact, Joe later even inferred that he had turned down a $10 million deal from elsewhere before doing business with Spotify because he knew that the pod was worth more than that.
It don't really mean nothing to me to say no to the $10 million deal because I've never had $10 million. Yeah, no, this is worth much more than that.
10 million.
Ironically, Rory said during Joe's announcement that business and friendship can often end disastrously.
When you go in business with your friends, can you not only fuck up the business because of your friendship, fuck up your friendship because of the business?
And he then went on to say that the show will fall apart if they are not there consistently, not on strike.
Other podcasts can do that. We can't do that. We have to be every single Wednesday. We need to be there. That's how we built this podcast. That's why it's consistent.
Too right, Rory, too right. Now, for the record, quite some time later, Marisa would speak out, saying that she didn't see a penny from the Spotify deal, despite her appearing on around 70 episodes in Joe's back catalogue that were then brought onto Spotify as part of this deal.
They put it on, they get the deal with Spotify. There's 77 episodes of me on Spotify. I don't get a dime for that. No one had a conversation with me about that.
But that's no surprise, and chances are she didn't have any kind of contract or agreement with Joe that she would own any of it. Because at the end of the day, it's the Joe Budden podcast. But sadly, Rory and Mal couldn't see that fact in plain view even 2 years into the podcast. And ultimately that didn't matter, because from here, the podcast went from strength to strength, becoming the #1 podcast on Spotify for 2019. #1, the top, above everyone, the top podcast, Joe Budden. At a certain point, Joe Budden began being profiled in the media as the future of podcasting. Joe was featured in Forbes magazine, being portrayed as a titan of technology in the new age of digital broadcasting. New York Times were calling him the hip-hop Howard Stern. Joe had truly become the podfather. But of course, the pattern would continue. Around this time, the Joe Budden brand had never been so strong. And according to Joe's later rant, after he signed that deal with Spotify, he was getting $1 million offers left, right, and center.
I took that deal, and you know what happened after that? I got M's from everywhere.
With Joe eventually saying that he realized that as time progressed after signing with Spotify, that deal ended up being the smallest one on the table compared to the other deals that were coming his way after.
What I'm spending the most time on is my podcast. For me, it's my most valuable asset. Also, for me right now, I'm being paid the least in it.
Now, if you ask me, this was a bit of egomania from Joe. Of course the deals he got after Spotify were bigger, because that deal upped the price and the desirability of Joe Budden as an entity. He became Spotify's biggest podcast, partly because his podcast is very good, but also partly because of Spotify pushing his voice out there. But Joe never seemed to want to give Spotify any credit for the part that they played in believing in him, giving him a big deal, and essentially upping the stock price on Joe Budden. And unsurprisingly, as the deal reached its end stages, cracks began to appear, and the dark side of Joe Budden would once again emerge. And Joe ultimately ended up ditching Spotify once that deal came up for renewal, because he said that they were pillaging his audience and not valuing him properly. But it wasn't just turning down the deal, but the way Joe turned down the deal that would end up creating massive tension between him and his co-hosts Rory and Mal, who appeared to be entirely excluded from Joe's decision-making process in negotiations with that Spotify deal. Because, it's Joe's podcast. And in the end, it was Joe turning down a second massive bag from Spotify that would change the dynamic of the Joe Budden podcast and his relationship with his co-hosts forever. Joe addressed his issues with Spotify in depth in episode 375, saying at this point they only had 7 episodes left in their deal.
We are approaching, what 7 episodes left means is we are approaching the end of our Spotify contract. New episodes of this podcast will no longer be available on Spotify exclusively.
Joe said that he did the deal with Spotify initially to gain information, which kind of ties in with him using his role at Complex to discover the kind of deals they were getting from brands like Spotify.
This Spotify deal was done as a whole to gain information.
So Joe actually explained that he joined Spotify around the same time as Amy Schumer did with her supposedly $1 million podcast deal. Joe suggested that they had actually undervalued him at the point of signing the deal and overvalued Amy Schumer.
They had an Amy Schumer podcast that was coming that was gonna blow through the wall. They were valuing improperly.
And once both of those shows had debuted, she underperformed whilst Joe Budden's podcast overperformed massively.
You guessed it. Amy Schumer has underperformed. We're 900% above your projections. We've recouped in hour 1. Hey, the site crashed when we launched.
And you'd have thought that after delivering so highly on this deal, when it came to renegotiations, Spotify would be treating him like the golden child. However, in the end, he said that he ended up feeling slighted by Spotify, saying that when the Joe Budden podcast got to #1 in the rankings, instead of a bonus, they offered to buy the podcast hosts Rolexes.
Y'all are #1! And hey, we want to offer you a token of our appreciation. Can we get you guys watches? Rolexes.
But according to Joe, they picked out watches to the tune of around $200,000. And then Spotify turned around and said those watches were too expensive.
Everybody picked a watch that was appropriate to them. The bill was no more than $200,000. And Spotify came back and said,
And then after that, Spotify wouldn't give them a vacation or let them give money to their fans. And then, apparently, Spotify also refused to give Joe and the boys a break from podcasting over Christmas.
I submitted those days for a vacation. Let me stop playing around. And what I got back was, nah.
Nah.
No.
So in Joe's opinion, Spotify had undervalued his contribution to the bottom line and disrespected him by not giving him any kind of bonus for becoming the #1 podcast on the platform. However, if you ask me, there was bigger disrespect going on here. The timing of this fallout is important because fellow toe-headed microphone shouter Joe Rogan was given a $100 million deal by Spotify only a few months before Joe Budden's fallout, with many saying that Joe Rogan's check was now the bar for Spotify podcast deals. And apparently Spotify weren't willing to give Joe Budden a fat check like the other bald shouty boy named Joe. Now clearly there was some kind of behind the scenes negotiating going on between Joe Budden and Spotify during this period, which Joe has remained fairly quiet about. In fact, he said numerous times that everything's covered by tons of NDAs and it would be illegal for him to talk about the facts of the negotiation. That sounds like a whole bunch of cap to me, but whatever. But some people have come out to say that Joe Budden had asked Spotify for a whopping $250 million. And by some, I mean top op Andrew Schulz.
And then I heard from the grapevine that Joe asked Spotify for $250 million.
This was a claim which, for the record, Joe denied, sort of, in episode 380.
Andrew Schulz is running around saying that we asked for $250 million from Spotify.
Was that real? I saw that headline of the clip. I didn't click it.
Rory.
He didn't really say that, right?
He said that.
And even if that was the case, so what?
Let's pretend that Joe asked for $250. Who the fuck is this white dude and this Indian dude sitting in these chairs that get to discuss me?
And Joe Budden would later go on to say that Joe Rogan's deal size didn't influence his decision.
Well, he want this because Rogan got that. You are poorly mistaken if you think the battles that Joe Rogan fights and the battles that I fight are the same fight.
Look, whether or not Joe asked for 250 M's or 100 M's, or just 50 litres in head moisturiser, the fact is, Joe Budden clearly didn't get what he wanted. And despite Joe Budden protesting that he didn't ask for some insane amount of money without actually disclosing what he did want, the other dimension of Joe's anger was that while he was still there at Spotify, they made numerous big acquisitions of other podcast companies, like Gimlet Media, a podcast network who they acquired for allegedly around $200 million.
February 2019, Gimlet, $250 million. Gimlet is a company. Mm-hmm. They have 1 million podcasts.
Well, sure, Joe denied asking outright for $250 million for his podcast deal. But in his rant dissing Spotify, he did say that he had made them 9 figures.
We have earned you 9 figures. I don't need to get into the how.
Now, Joe later explained why he thought this, pointing out that Spotify had used a promo code Joe to get people to sign up for their service for the first time. And when Joe asked for the accounting on how many people signed up, Spotify basically finessed him and wouldn't say.
Hey, pull up the numbers from the Joe code. Know what they said? You f***ing guessed it. Hey, we got hacked.
Sucks when you doesn't get the accounting you asked for, doesn't it, Joe? Anywho, that was the end of the road for the Joe Budden podcast and Spotify. And from here, the Joe Budden podcast would have a new home, because a month after this revved up rant dissing Spotify, Joe Budden announced a new home for the Joe Budden podcast, the newly launched Joe Budden Network. Well, I wonder how Rory and Mal are going to fit into this. So, Joe Budden launches his own network. No longer just a peon with one podcast named after himself, Joe was clearly trying to get to that 9-figure acquisition deal by pivoting from being just a pathetic podcast host into a podcast network CEO. Ironically, I'd say that just like with the podcast, it seems that it was Joe's ego that led him to name his podcast network once again after himself, which, just I'll be completely honest, to me has the unintended effect of combining the entire business operation and attaching it to Joe Budden's unstable personality. I mean, he should have just called it it bald-faced media, or just some shit that he could sell and then move on to? That's how you do a business. But anyway, he announces his new network and that it's got a female focus. And look, call me a cynic, but I would wager that Joe really just did this to make his network a more appealing prospect for being acquired by a super woke company like Spotify. But I think Joe made a fatal error in thinking that just throwing women in front of a microphone would be enough, without ensuring that, they were actually good and entertaining shows. Because let's face it, launching 2 female-focused podcasts hosted by a bunch of uncharismatic nobodies isn't really going to get you to those 9 figures. And the views on those podcasts reflects that. But anyway, more on how Joe Budden really appreciates the women on his team later. Clearly, Rory and Mal thought that they were in for a massive payday when the Spotify deal came up for renegotiation in 2020. But we now know that wasn't the case. It seems that there were millions on the table from Spotify, but it wasn't the hundreds of millions that Joe Budden thought he might have been entitled to. So Joe turned down the Spotify deal, whatever it was, and set out to restructure his podcasting setup into a full-blown network. With Joe even saying on the pod that he had turned the Spotify deal down in the hope that he would one day make all of his team millionaires.
We don't feel bad turning down these millions, right?
No, I actually feel
we're not spending
amazing.
money that we didn't attain. We know what the value is. We know what the worth is. One day I want to come in here and spit that whole verse. Bleak made millions. He made millions. Mal made millions. Parks made millions. Beans to tell you if you want. I want to say that.
Joe later would also heavily infer that Spotify was intending to own the complete rights to everything he and his co-host did in the future after signing that deal. Like they're buying a network.
Spotify comes and says, yo, I got $25 million for you. $30 million for you over the course of 5 years. All of that, including your audio rights, your TV rights, your video digital rights, your book rights, your advertising rights.
So Joe decided to kick that deal to the curb, diss Spotify on his podcast, and burn that bridge fully. After Joe fully turned down the deal and aired out Spotify on his podcast numerous times, once it was clear the deal was definitely not happening, Spotify reacted, releasing the following statement, which was reproduced in numerous news outlets. It was our desire to keep Joe Budden on Spotify. As Joe referenced on his show, we made him a considerable offer, one which was significantly larger and many times the value of the existing agreement and reflective of the current market and size of his audience. Unfortunately, we could not come to terms, and we respect his wishes to find a new home for his show. Meanwhile, the hip-hoposphere reacted, with Charlemagne questioning Joe Budden's decision and suggesting that they are fighting different fights.
It sounds to me like Joe Budden is a person who knows his worth, but doesn't know how to properly negotiate it. Because if you keep doing deals with various corporations and you keep getting trash-ass deals, that's on you. When I heard Joe comparing his show to Spotify signing Gimlet for hundreds of millions and The Ringer for hundreds of millions and Paracast for hundreds of millions. I think it's very important to note that they got that money from Spotify because they are actual networks with tons of IP. All I know is that if you keep having the same issues with various companies because it was the same thing at Complex, it's probably not them, it's probably you, Joe. You would never see me act like that.
And of course, Academics threw his hat into the ring, dissing Joe Budden's stooges for even having an opinion on his business dealings.
You clearly are workers. Stop talking like bosses. Because when Joe talks about how the negotiation with Spotify and how he feels about Spotify is, y'all shut the fuck up. Not because y'all have a different opinion, it's because your boss is the only one who Spotify deals with.
Now, this is where Academics really begun to go hard on Joe's stooges on his live streams. In fact, dissing Rory and Mal became a regular fixture on DJ Academics' Twitch streams.
Because I was watching and listening to Joe talk about him leaving Spotify, and them little stooges sound like they had no idea of nothing about negotiation. They're your employees. Spotify don't give two about them. They're negotiating with you, Joe. You the boss.
Look, I'll admit it, I kind of like Rory and Mal, but Academics just made dissing them so entertaining that I was ready to spin the block with him every single stream.
When we listen to Joe Budden podcast, we ain't trying to hear you niggas. We're trying to hear Joe. Do you bums realize that Joe's talent is carrying you? If Joe ever said, okay, fine, I'll take this deal and I'm separate from them, y'all are canceled. Nobody will sign you, bum ass. To Rory and Mal, you untalented bums, we ain't in the same fight. So when y'all comment on anything I do, I feel offended. You're bums. You're stooges. You're untalented. You ain't build shit. Matter of fact, if you did build shit, Joe wouldn't be in the position he was in. He would have a network because you bums have built something successful. But y'all can't. You're ad-libbers. Half of the words you say in the podcast is, That's crazy. You're untalented. Get the fuck out of here. Yeah, it would be very hard for me to shit on Joe. Joe is mad talented. I'm like, what's his name? Molly Mall?
The reality is that academics, just like Charlemagne before him, were speaking absolute facts, going on his streams to predict perfectly everything that would unfold between Joe Budden and his stooges the following year.
Rory, you're not you're on Joe Budden's podcast. You're on Joe Budden. The only gripe you might have is Joe don't want to give you a raise. You don't have no gripe with Spotify. They're not emailing you. They're not emailing your lawyer. They're talking to Joe. Tell Rory and Mal to talk about their deals, not Joe's deal. They're talking about Joe's deal. Why don't y'all talk about what y'all feel y'all worth that Joe should pay y'all? Oh, let me guess. Spotify don't talk to y'all. Spotify talks to Joe Budden and Ian, his manager.
Joe continued to record several episodes for Spotify to run out his deal, continuing to diss them as he went.
If you're not subscribed on YouTube, I advise you to do it now. You already know the vibe. 6 episodes left and we can get the fuck out of here.
Funny thing is though, this is where the seeds of doubt begun to be sown. Because in the episode following Joe's announcement that he had turned down big M's from Spotify in the pursuit of a 9-figure deal, it was immediately clear that people in Rory and Mal's personal lives were shocked by the fact that they weren't taking the multi-million-dollar Spotify deal.
Phone was a little busy the last 2 days.
Yours?
Yeah. Called me like, yo, you need some. Oh, like, we're not broke. Yeah. Yo, you ever thought about like talking to Apple?
Joe would then go on to address Charlemagne's comments about his negotiations, essentially dissing Charlemagne for not owning his spot on The Breakfast Club, calling him out for just being a worker for iHeartMedia.
Charlemagne, you're not gonna get it because I own this. You, my friend, work for iHeart.
Workers, eh? Shame the guy sitting next to Joe Budden didn't pay closer attention to this rant. Or hey, maybe they did. Anywho, as Joe got a lot of Spotify hating and yelling out of his system, with only a handful of Spotify exclusive episodes left, Joe and his boys would continue pushing forward with only the occasional anti-Spotify outburst.
We get right off of this platform.
Yeah, that's a fact.
In 3 episodes.
That's a fact.
Now that was in episode 379. And funnily enough, Joe wasn't really feeling it on this podcast. In fact, during the show, he seemed to receive a message that really put him off. And after he'd seen it, he barely spoke for the rest of the podcast as Rory and Mal picked up the slack, with Joe eventually leaving them to finish off the episode by themselves as he walked off the set.
Can I go home? Can y'all finish this out without me, honestly?
Yeah.
I want to go.
I know you want to go, but P-Valley is your shit, man.
Yeah,
we got to
talk
about
on
it.
Saturday.
Yeah. But
it turns out that Joe Budden had actually been witnessing his own cancellation in real time. But I tell you what, you won't believe what he was being cancelled for. Joe returned in the episode after his walk-off in a jubilant mood, celebrating the final completion of their Spotify contract.
Made it through the entire term of a contract. Clap it up. Clap it up.
Yeah.
Clap it up.
It was close.
Though things were perhaps a touch awkward between Joe and Rory.
Brother Rory is here. Rory's here. Hey.
Man. How you doing?
Pretty good, Rory. How about yourself?
I feel great.
Good.
I'm glad you're feeling better. What? No, it's cool. It's cool.
Joe went on to give an explanation for his abrupt walk-off in the previous episode.
You guys are great. I'm back, baby. I fucking left in the middle of the YouTube. I had to go. Last podcast, it wasn't time for me to sit here and talk about any of the shit that we was talking about. I had things going on in my mind. So I left.
Joe went on to say that there had been an attempted smear campaign against him. Now, he's referring to a couple of news stories that were released around this time, where it was suggested that Joe had gotten physical with his ex Tahiri, something which he's denied, calling her a liar, and also audio leaked, where Joe's other ex and mother of his child, Sin Santana, inferred that he's been abusive to her, something which Joe also denied, and I genuinely can't believe I've got to say this, that he dogs. Yes, from here we saw headlines that said Joe Budden denies he has sex with dogs and abuses women. This led to a frankly insane moment on social media where Joe Budden had to come out and outright deny doing the dirty with dogs.
The claims of abuse toward women this week from me took a back seat to dog abuse claims. Joe is not intimate with dog. This is craziness that we have to address, this stupidity.
After being mauled by the press, Joe took the lead and spoke out, barking that the allegations against him were all part of a smear campaign orchestrated by Spotify in response to Joe dissing them.
A smear campaign might be taking place, and that would have to be done and executed by Spotify.
Joe went on to acknowledge the coincidental timing of this beef and smear campaign with the newly announced launch of Charlemagne's new podcast network, Black Effect. Now, regardless regardless of their salaciousness, the allegations against Joe didn't stick. Joe wasn't cancelled, his podcast wasn't cancelled, and he kept on going. And when episode 382 rolled around, this officially represented them moving forward from their Spotify contract. Joe went on to thank Cash App for their ongoing support as a sponsor, to which Rory ironically replied that he would need to see accounting on.
I'm thanking Cash App because they enable me. Yeah.
Wait, if this is an ad, I need to see accounting.
Anywho, with the Spotify deal firmly declined and in the rear view, after this episode, the Joe Budden podcast boys would take a well-earned vacation since Spotify wouldn't let them take time off before. And upon their return, Joe was able to continue the podcast independently and keep on pushing forward towards his goal. Debuting the Joe Budden Podcast 2.0 with a slick intro video, which came along from an original beat from King of the Old Heads DJ Premier, and ending with a title card placing the Joe Budden Podcast firmly under the control of the Joe Budden Network. Oh, the workers ain't gonna like that. The Joe Budden Network was going to be big business, baby! And Joe Budden's network strategy was in full effect. In order to position his newly founded network favorably in the eyes of woke companies like Spotify, of course the first two podcasts he launched, other than the Joe Budden podcast, were the female-focused shows See the Thing Is and Girl I Guess. See the Thing Is, these shows kinda didn't get popping like Joe maybe hoped they would, as both of them had decent debuts, but Girl I Guess You weren't that entertaining, because over time the view accounts of both shows steadily declined. Now, in my opinion, Joe kinda takes an L here. I just don't understand why he didn't just start a second podcast where he hosts alongside a big name female personality that he doesn't really agree with. You know, kinda like H3 did with Frenemies, RIP. I mean, just imagine Joe Budden having a screaming row with some famous super woke chick every week. It would have been fire, and it would have ticked the female quota. It's interesting, you know, there was a real podcast boom going on around this time. You had people like Adam22 over at No Jumper launching a whole bunch of new side shows and podcasts for his channel, and talking about the female focus, his Thoughts Next Door show, headed up by Selena Powell, ended up being so popular, with Selena Powell talking so reckless about the industry, Adam basically had to shut it down because he was catching so much flack. Anywho, enough of me clout sucking Adam, I just think that's a really interesting contrast. Joe, if you want to get that bag, get Selena Powell on. Anyway, after turning down numerous M's from Spotify, without a big bag for Rory and Mal, tensions begun to flare between the hosts on Joe's main show. But to make matters worse, Joe was still cutting deals for himself. In fact, many people in the industry were positively baffled when it came out that after turning down multiple millions from Spotify, Joe went on to sign some kind of deal with Patreon, where they gave Joe a seemingly no-show title as head of creator equity, and announcing that Joe's podcast would now be available on Patreon. Because why get it for free on YouTube and not Spotify, when you can get it on Patreon for money that you don't need to spend? In fact, if you like giving creators free money for stuff that they'd already be doing, perhaps you might consider going on over to patreon.com/TraplawRoss and signing up there to get your name in the credits of these videos, and helping me finance my crippling addiction to expensive hip-hop merch. I actually really hope they let me return this hat. Anyway, some people have suggested that Joe Budden's sly rebranding as the Joe Budden Network to have really been a bit of a power move to usurp Rory and Mal from their position as partners on the most popping podcast Joe had going, repositioning his relationship with them to simply co-host/employees on one of the many shows that's owned and operated by the Joe Budden Network. And so, in lieu of these strange and kind of smart business moves, the iconic friendship amongst the three amigos from the Joe Budden podcast would soon wane and decline. And the tension amongst the co-hosts was noted not just by the fans, but also the ops. In fact, DJ Academics even took to his stream in February 2021 to react to the tension between the co-hosts when his name was brought up in episode 411.
These bums get so uncomfortable when my name get brought up. Rory, he's gonna get beat red. This albino dweeby, he just gets like, I think he answered a phone call, but you could see the home screen. Nobody was calling him. You gotta sit there and watch your boss mention me while you like, you huffing and puffing, nigga. Well, write an HR report to that.
At one point, Ack even says that Rory and Mal should pull up and do a podcast with him.
Let me invite you, both of you bums, Jay-Z, Pre-Cum, Mealy Mall, and of course, you albino bum, to pull up. It will be me, y'all two. Let's have a podcast, but y'all can't do it because Joe won't give y'all approval because he knows y'all are bums.
Just imagine Rory, Mal, and Academics. That three-way argument is $1 million pay-per-view right there. Anyway, Academics went on to explosively expose the fact that even at this early point in the game, February 2021, Rory had already been complaining behind the scenes to industry people that he didn't feel like Joe Budden was paying him enough and that his deal wasn't right.
I'm telling you, stop calling industry niggas and complaining that Joe not paying you enough. Stop trying to flex to other people that you got a contract and you got lawyers. You're not gonna sue Joe. You don't have anything.
Now, apparently Joe didn't even know this at the time, but then in the following episode 412, Joe had an announcement to make, that he had signed that deal with Patreon, with Joe revealing to fans that if you joined on Patreon, you would get 2 Patreon exclusive podcast episodes. Cut to episode 422, starting out with Joe Budden addressing comments that his ego had gotten out of control.
Commenters are saying that my ego is about to be the demise of this podcast.
Well, it's been the demise of other things in your life.
These comments were then followed by Joe arguing with the guys about the distinction between his network and the podcast.
Well, while you're on your ego, I do have some gripes about the JBN. I did want to come here and talk about some things.
Rory goes on to say that he did a guest appearance on the See the Thing Is podcast on the Joe Budden Network, with Rory explaining that the way the cast on that show were treated was so much better than the way that he's treated on the Joe Budden podcast.
I see like a lot of white dishes with amazing pasta meals and like real silverware. And then I started to hinder back on how I'm treated at this podcast with my bags of Cheetos and plastic forks. Why are you favoriting that podcast? We get nothing over here. We don't even get snacks.
Now, Joe and Mal brushed these comments off in a joking way, and Rory's comments were swept aside like they were nothing. But then in the now iconic episode 423, everything would come pouring out. Eventually, Rory could no longer contain his dissatisfaction with the behind-the-scenes tension he was having with Joe, and they ended up straight up beefing on camera.
You're just gonna play every song as we talk about them.
Oh, no, you're right. It'd be better if you did a whole DJ session in the middle of a great podcast and get up.
Rory also said less jokingly that he much prefers it on the other podcast.
He didn't do none of this on See the Thing Is, by the way. He didn't have none of these jokes.
I like it better over there.
And then things truly fell apart, as a tense interaction between Joe and Rory led to Joe inviting Rory outside for an actual fist fight.
It's nice out today. We can go. I'm gonna put him down, and we're gonna come back in here and pod.
When Joe walks back in, yo, my knee was fucked. Yo, my knee get better.
Rory, stop playing with me, man. Stop, because I love you. Stop. Stop it. Stop it. I don't even let like you play with me like this.
And after that interaction had calmed down, Joe reminded everybody that they were all friends here, to which Rory dropped the devastating reply that they were not.
23 fight friends.
No, at 40 I'm not fighting.
Come on.
Who the f said we was friends?
The hell do I look?
Now, the boys finished the recording of this episode without any more incidents, but the damage was now done. The cat was out of the bag, and the tension between Rory and Joe was no longer tenable. Rory had said straight up that he preferred it at the other podcast, and that him and Joe weren't friends. It might have sounded like a joke, but he meant it. And sensing an uncomfortable atmosphere on the recording floor, Joe decided to take action. And at this point, allegedly, Joe had got in touch with Rory, telling him via text message to take a few episodes off the pod. And from there, everything went to shit. A week later, Joe appears without Rory or Mal in episode 424. Instead, Joe is joined by friends of the show from way back, Ice and Savon. Now, what was interesting here was not just the absence of the usual co-hosts, which Joe explained simply as them being on vacation, but what was really telling was the audience response to this episode. Many commented in support of the co-host change, citing Rory and Mal's tendency in recent episodes to not want to diss or make fun of big industry names like Jay-Z or his Rock Nation, as well as references to Joe and his new co-host communicating in a much more friendly and positive way than Joe had previously been communicating with Rory and Mal. Now, that episode was followed by episode 425, an episode titled Tea Leaves, which featured Joe alongside Ice. And this episode got a mixed response. Joe made numerous pointed references in this episode to showing up and getting the job done, kind of inferring some kind of refusal of Rory and Mal to appear on the podcast, at which point media outlets began reporting of a strike on the Joe Budden podcast. Joe went on to explain what had occurred from his side of things, saying that they were having a business disagreement without going into too much excruciating detail, acknowledging that there had been on-air tension between him and his co-hosts, but also leaving the door open for them to return to their seats on the show, and admitting that following the tension in that previous episode, that he had told Rory to take a few episodes off.
Man, I hit Rory and say, yo, dog, do me a favor, take a couple pods off.
Now, in response to this at the time, apparently Mal had asked Joe what gives him the right to tell Rory to take episodes off.
Yo, dog, what makes you think that you can tell Rory to not come in the pod for a little bit?
Now, in that episode, Joe said simply that that talk did not go well. But we would find out what he said to Mal in that conversation later on.
And I gotta be honest, it didn't go to great.
It did not. It did not.
Clearly, Joe's airing of the grievance didn't do the trick, and he returned with Ish and Ice co-hosting the episode in 426, with yet another big dislike ratio.
Thumbs down away! Hey!
Now, up until this point, Rory and Mal had remained silent on the issue, and while Joe explained business still hadn't been handled, he didn't go into detail about what Rory and Mal's gripes were. However, there was a lot of talk over saltiness about the Spotify deal not getting taken, and Joe defended himself, saying that because Spotify wanted the rights to everybody's work on different platforms, he wanted to turn the deal down, and because he turned the deal down, he said that they were all making more money now without the Spotify deal.
If I would have took the deal.
Right, the new deal.
The new deal.
So y'all
Everyone's making more.
From here, there was a lot of talk inferring that Rory and Mal were workers and Joe is the boss.
When you go to work every day, I don't give a fuck if you make 50 grand. I don't care if you make $400,000 a year, right? You're an employee. Again, you are over their level of comprehension because they are employees.
So after that, Joe continued to do episodes without Rory and Mal. And with each drop, it seemed like the fans were getting more and more used to Joe's new co-hosts. And soon, the comments would have people saying that they preferred the show's new direction. At this point, it seemed like Rory and Mal had truly played themselves. And as he continued recording, Joe would continue dropping salty comments, referencing co-hosts not turning up.
Welcome to episode 4. The episodes go slow when your co-hosts bail. Here with a few people that showed up.
Between episodes, Joe Budden also appeared in an interview with the CEO of Patreon, Beardy McWhat's-his-face. Now, this was much more fireside chat than Smoke the Entire Pack. This painted Joe as much more of a new media tech CEO than just a raving lunatic of a podcast host. And Joe's run without his regular podcast co-host would continue for a whopping 10 episodes, ending on episode 434 titled Tycoon, by which time the dislike ratio was looking much more healthy. And the comments seemed to suggest that at this point the fans had accepted their new co-hosts fully. So as the sentiment on the podcast was turning, many people were asking, where the hell are Rory and Mal? And there was nobody asking it more than DJ Academics. While Joe Budden was pressing forward with his new co-hosts, Rory and Mal were dealing with a media shitstorm, and their earlier beef with DJ Academics had fermented into a nightmare scenario. Meanwhile, DJ Academics was positively basking in the demise of his ops. Mere days after Joe first appeared on his podcast, Sam's the Stooges, Academics took to Instagram to flex his new whips and shit on Rory and Mal for being workers in a post saying, "I heard the Stooges are on strike. Don't worry, I still need a full-time detailer for my cars." And Axe cars are lit, I can't lie. And Academics would later take to Twitch to twist the knife in a raucous hour-long live stream devoted exclusively to spinning the block on Rory and Mal.
None of y'all are more successful than me. None of y'all have accomplished what I've done. None of y'all have done it from the ground up. Y'all have ridden from dick to dick, ball sack to ball sack. Mealy Mall, I'll holla at you. I call you Jay-Z pre-cum. I seen Jay-Z's name came up. I could have saw this thing and pulled out like lip gloss and put it around his lips. I bet. The first of the month is coming. And I can't afford rent. He can't afford shit. Get back to work, you f***ing bum.
Ack would go on to break down the beef with Rory and Mal in great detail, calling them out for being hired help.
These two dweebs up here have sucked Joe Budden in all his business move ventures while they aren't really a part of it. They're hired help. The Joe Budden podcast, the IP doesn't belong to three of them. It belongs to Joe. Joe owns the show. Spotify was never negotiating with Rory and Mal.
Ack would go on to point out that Rory and Mal never created anything of value outside of their mere appearance on the Joe Budden podcast, leaving them with no leverage to negotiate.
You should have created some type of worth for yourself that you could leverage Joe with.
But even more explosively, Academics would go on to reveal that in September 2020, Rory had actually pulled up to Academics' home and put a note in his mailbox, with Rory apparently trying to be on some gangster shit.
He drove up to my house in a Kia, him and another guy. They didn't even hop out the car. They swung open the door and they stuffed a letter in my mailbox. This is what the letter says. This is the letter, and look what the letter says. It's Boss's Day. Yep, that's right. We're on top of things as usual. Look, love a stooge with a smiley face.
So this all happened back in September 2020, and it coincided with a tense back and forth that Rory and Academics had on Twitter, where Ack had tweeted to Rory to stop mentioning him, saying, "Stop mentioning me with your whack conspiracy theories. You the same hoe that had to ask Jay-Z's permission to propose to your future wife could never be me." To which Rory replied, acting like Rory Soprano out here, starting off a tweet with digits supposedly from Academics' zip code, then saying, "Word of advice from somebody that has no interest in harming you. It's a real world out there, King. You work to put your family in a better place. Don't let these streams project your insecurities into a tone you know you're not familiar with. To which Ak replied, shut up, I'm on live right now, get on and talk, we ain't got time for your dumb shit. To which Rory Walnuts replied once again on some gang shit, I see you missed the point. From somebody who comes from the same addiction, that liquor ain't the answer. So I won't finish the rest of that zip code. Congrats on the new crib. Shit, I'm surprised Rory didn't ask Ak to kiss his ring. Anyway, it would turn out that those tweets from Rory, seemingly teasing Akademiks' zip code, were essentially Rory self-snitching, quite literally a day after he had been to Akademiks' house to post a creepy letter in his mailbox.
The next day, I'm on Twitch and I see them start tweeting out numbers of a zip code. I think he said, congrats on a new house or something like that. Oh, he's trying to let me know he knows where I live, but it connects with the fact that he probably realized, like, wait, this realized I was dropped off something in his mailbox. Anyway.
Hey, look, we all know real G's move in silence and then tweet about their crimes immediately afterwards, just in case it was unclear who did them. Anywho, Akademiks even went on to say that Rory's side chick had visited his house, confirming the handwriting on the letter was by Rory, and telling him that Rory was disgruntled with the money he was receiving from Joe.
Your side chick came here and said, oh, that's Rory's handwriting. She was like, yo, hey, you know, he should be getting paid more. Like, yo, he feels he should be getting paid more by Joe, this, that, and third.
Things were a mess at this point, okay? For everyone. And as yet another sign that things weren't looking too positive, Mal was spotted unfollowing Joe Budden on both Twitter and Instagram. So, as time continues to pass with no sign of the Stooges, things turned into a goddamn game of where's Rory? And with no updates for the fans, people were speculating whether or not there was some kind of lawsuit coming. Everyone was thirsting for a Rory update. In fact, in a hilarious comment replying to Joe Budden, who had said that everyone, including his barber, wanted to know what was going on with the podcast. I mean, I'm not sure why Joe needs a barber, but whatever. Even your boy Drizzy Drake chimed in, saying on Instagram, I saw Rory sipping a Sauvignon Blanc tonight, and he made a toast, but everyone else was engaged in conversation. So his glass was hanging in the air for like a good 17 seconds before they clued in. If that's any update. Drake, you are a savage. Anywho, Akademiks finally found Rory stalking around outside a nightclub and reacted to it in yet another hilarious stream.
Chat, we found Rory. You know where we found his bum ass? The is now he's moonlighting as a reject paparazzi.
Yes, apparently Rory had been spotted by paparazzi outside a venue, hosting a party for Kylie and Kendall Jenner in the middle of his podcast feud. And even the paparazzi were trying to find out what was going on with the podcast, with Rory being caught on camera trying to be modest as hell.
Hey, what's up, Rory? Rory, what up? How's it going, man?
Fuck up? Nobody. Why y'all take pictures
come
of
on,
me?
Rory. We know who you are, man.
I just gotta say, I love how the paparazzi even tries to console Rory. Like, oh, come on, Rory, we know who you are, man.
Oh, come on, Rory. We know who you are, man.
But even Rory's modesty didn't stop DJ Akademiks sticking the boot in.
Joe! 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 We found him! I found his bum ass. Get this bum back to work. You know where you find that bum? After we found him at Home Depot and he was trying to hop on the truck for construction work, and I said, Rory! Get to my pool!
At a certain point, cracking under the pressure of people asking what the hell was going on with admittedly their only gig, somebody tweeted at him, so are we never going to hear from Rory and Mal? It's been a month at this point and I'm starting to feel like they don't care about the fans, man. We support you guys just like Joe. We want to hear from you guys. A week later, Rory finally tweeted with an update saying, love and appreciate all the support from the listeners. I'm still from the cloth where you stay quiet whilst internal and personal business is being dealt with. But I get it. It's a public platform and people want to know the status of the show. There'll be some answers soon. Meanwhile, Mal spoke out with a much more straightforward tweet saying, respect is non-negotiable. A line that would end up having far more significance as this beef continued to play out. To which Akademiks chimed in with a savage reply, saying, you not getting a raise, you can give up on that. Matter of fact, your pay should be getting cut in half and equity shouldn't be in your vocabulary anymore. They forgot about your ass after 4 weeks. But that wasn't enough. Triggered by Rory Corleone's liberal use of the word cloth, Akademiks hopped on live stream once again to choose out which type of cloth would line Rory's coffin at his funeral, live on Twitch.
Bum ass been using words like, you're like, the cloth. You're broke! The only cloth you're from is the unemployment line. You ever disliking so much you might have to show up to his grave every day and just like crip walk on the shit real quick? He's unemployed, albino, a bum. He's a bum. Did I mention that? And then also, he's irrelevant and replaceable. Anyway, he says, I'm still from the cloth where you stay quiet while internal and personal business is being dealt with.
Oh, and of course Akademiks had smoke for Mal too.
There are 2 broke, bum-ass losers, and one is the pre-cum of Jay-Z hanging and swinging like Tarzan from ballsack to ballsack.
Ack went in again smoking Rory Pack on 420.
Rory!
And saying how much better the show was without the Stooges. But unfortunately, the victory lap wouldn't last forever. Much to the disappointment of DJ Academics, Joe, Rory and Mal would eventually reunite very briefly in an attempt to give fans some resolution. Joe, Rory and Mal were seen meeting around a week before we finally got a reunion podcast. And Rory and Mal would come back on the air with Joe Budden in episode 435, titled Shaking the Tree. And I'll tell you what, this was an explosive return, as Rory and Mal appeared to air out their grievances with Joe in person, elaborating on the conversation that went down between Mal and Joe that led to the strike. Remember when Mal asked Joe what gives him the right to tell Rory to take a couple episodes off the podcast? Well, we finally found out what Joe's response was. Apparently, he told Mal the podcast is none of his business.
Joe, you looked me in my face and told me this show was none of my business.
Yeah.
That's what you told me.
I was there.
This prompted Mal to feel like Joe had no respect for him or Rory, and as a result, Mal decided not to appear on the podcast, i.e. the strike.
You're telling me now that I abandoned the ship when we both agreed that the three of us should figure out what we're trying to do within this pod, and let's do it in a timely manner too.
I'll take account.
Like,
that's
so easy.
But if you think that you was gonna look me in my face and tell me this show was none of my business and I was gonna record, you got Mal fucked up. You know that wasn't happening.
Now, perhaps Mal had expected Joe to have reflected on the situation, and by the time they sat down to record together, be ready to show his friends / co-hosts some respect. But when pressed on this live on air, Joe delivered a death blow to the friendship, saying plainly, what makes Mal think that Joe owes him anything, respect or otherwise?
You owe friends respect.
I don't believe that.
Yes, you do.
You don't believe that you owe your friends respect?
Now, Joe went on to recount a story about meeting Jay-Z and confronting him about their 15-year feud. Which again, if you didn't know, go back and watch my video on how Jay-Z sabotaged Joe Budden's career, break it all down for you there. Anyway, apparently, after 15 years of bitter feuding, Joe finally ran into Jay-Z and confronted him about the feud. To which Jay-Z apparently replied to Joe Budden, incredibly bluntly, saying, so what? And Joe decided to use this very same line to disregard his co-host's hurt feelings over him showing them no respect and swiftly replacing them to keep the show going.
I don't want to be insensitive and I don't want to gaslight, but as you gentlemen speak, I hear Hov in my head saying, so what?
Joe went on to make his feelings very clear as he passionately argued that they let him down when they didn't show up to record the podcast.
I take offense to Mal saying the show should have stopped. What other place in the world can y'all leave some shit? This will never stop. It's y'all's to participate in like our fucking contract says. I don't feel like you should be able to say we created it together if you leave it so freely.
And Joe kind of beat around the bushes in the way that he did it, but he spent a lot of time on the podcast trying to say in an indirect way without actually saying it that he is the boss and what he says goes.
I am the person that is supposed to tell Rory, yo dog, you should chill for a few. I want to hear where else you could have that type of smoke with the person at your job that is responsible for the job.
In fact, there was actually one moment that summed up the entire episode. As Joe yelled he never thought he'd see the day that Rory and Mal didn't show up for the podcast, and Mal replied he never thought he would see the day that Joe would tell him that the podcast was none of his business.
I never saw the day.
What day what?
That y'all would not be here.
I never saw the day when you would look me in my face and tell me this was none of my business.
And to this, Joe replied devastatingly, is it your business in the contract we have?
Is it your business in the contract that we have?
That contract.
To me, the show was over right here, but it continued to die in slow motion as they rambled out the duration of the episode, getting to the end of the recording with a final dose of tension from Rory.
There's a ceiling on transparency, there's a cap.
Surely is.
And of course, after this episode had released, your boy Academics was straight there reacting to it and roasting the Stooges.
You're not one of the bosses. The only transparency you need to see is your paycheck. Which, truth be told, you don't even deserve one. That shit should be transparent. Should be see-through. Should be nothing. By the way, keep talking about the cloth. You need a Kleenex to wipe your eyes. You're emotional.
Meanwhile, the Brilliant Idiots went on air with Andrew Schulz dissing them, saying that the podcast should be renamed the Call Me Daddy podcast because of how much Joe had sunned his co-hosts.
I think they call him Daddy. I think they switched the Joe Budden podcast to Call Him Daddy.
But despite the boos from the sidelines, the original trio did indeed return for another episode. Number 436, titled "The Floor Is Yours," it was immediately obvious that the tension between the hosts was still there. People had spotted this in the comments and were pointing out that this is probably the last ever appearance of Rory and Mal on the show. In the comments, they were saying that you could tell from Mal's demeanor that he will never look at Joe the same after the way Joe showed his true feelings in the previous episode. But rather than calling Mal and saying, "Hey buddy, why don't you sit out the next few episodes of the pod?" instead, Joe just went nuclear. In a since deleted episode of the podcast, 437, Joe fired his co-host live on air in a frenzied rant. Now, all of the copies of this episode have been removed from YouTube, so I'm not going to risk playing any clips from it, but I believe that episode might still be available in full on Joe's Patreon. So if you want to support him, go and join over there and watch any of the episodes that he's got up there. Support Joe. Please don't strike this video, Joe, please. Look, I can give you the key points of that podcast, but in many ways it was best experienced through the eyes of DJ Academics, who picked apart that episode in yet another amusing live stream. In fact, Joe even said in the podcast that he had spent some time watching DJ Academics' commentary on the situation. Considering he had prayed for the Stooges' downfall for months, Academics was so happy to see the Stooges being officially fired from the podcast. He put on his Versace robe, he broke out the cigars and the Henny bottle.
Get your black and molds. Get your Rory runs, put it up, light it up, and blow one in the air real quick while Joe ethers these.
Hell, Ack was even pumping weights at one point, getting ready to use Rory's head as the goddamn speed bag. Anyway, what did Joe say in this deleted episode? Well, he said pretty simply that Rory and Mal had been asking for accounting, squabbling about money behind the scenes, and that their failure to show up and record for the podcast represented a breach of their contract, with Joe literally firing Rory at the top of his lungs live on air. And Joe made it crystal clear that he had never given any IP or ownership of the podcast over to Rory and Mal, and that the network and the show were all his.
He owns it. He owns the IP. He's the guy that without him, it can't be a podcast.
Joe confirmed that his co-hosts were in contracts, which they never requested renegotiation on. However, Joe did say when that Spotify deal came around, Rory asked for some ownership, to which Joe said flat out, no. Instead, he gave them generous salaries and a profit split on the podcast deals, but no ownership.
He told them, hey, if we make $1, we could split it as per this percentage. Don't mean y'all own shit.
Joe says that he sent accounting off to Rory and Mal, breaking down the percentages they were due from the deals made on the podcast, and apparently Rory and Mal weren't happy with the accounting, with the suggestion that Rory didn't trust the accountants who had prepared the books. Joe also elaborated that a lot of Rory's disgruntlement came from Joe's relationship with Academics, and they had yet another tense moment when Joe acknowledged that he might one day work with Academics again, with Rory getting upset about this. And it was at this point in the podcast that Academics decided to officially hold a funeral for Rory, and sharing with the followers of his stream the custom Rory Runts Cali pack that he'd had mocked up for the occasion. I heard that Rory Runts gets you so high you forget how percentages work. Joe went on to say on the episode that he'd asked Rory directly if he had been to Academics' house to post that letter, and Rory flat out denied it. Joe also stressed that he doesn't believe Academics to be a liar. Meanwhile, at this point in the stream, Academics posted up the letter that Rory had dropped off on his Instagram and Twitter, along with the devastating captions, "This is why I ruined your life. I hope you have nightmares about doing this for the rest of your life, you bozo, RIP," and another post captioned, "This is Rory, you bum! Tried to play with me and you lost your job. I violated you daily and showed you a worker. You tweeted out my zip code and sent a letter to the crib. You took the L, didn't you? RIP bozo." Joe ended the podcast saying that they can audit, they can sue, and they will lose. Now, this didn't go down super well. Right now, I believe that video remains a Patreon exclusive, but from the 11th of May, when that was uploaded, the Joe Budden TV YouTube channel went into a downward spiral, losing thousands of subscribers, sometimes even 2,000 a day, a fall which it still hasn't recovered from as of writing. Even if he was well within his rights to say some of the things that he said in this episode, Joe's attitude and the savagery which he applied to his former friends truly damaged his reputation amongst some of his own fans. And so, with bridges burned and earth scorched, the fans waited on the edge of their seats for a response from Rory and Mal. A few days later, Rory and Mal responded with their own one-off podcast episode. Mal appeared in an impeccable powder blue tracksuit, alongside Rory, but together they explained their side of the story, suggesting that they had a percentage-based partnership contract with Joe, therefore they had asked for the accounting to work out what they were owed.
So we have to ask for accounting because how else will we know what we're supposed to get?
Body of an email and an Excel spreadsheet that people punch numbers into is not accounting.
Rory made it clear that the simplified accounting that he was sent via email was not satisfactory.
But accounting is not some shit you send in a 5-line item in the body of an email.
And Mal would go on to reveal that after a long period of trying to get accounts, they noticed what they described as a $400,000 mistake.
Well, we were supposed to get accounting quarterly. There was a quote-unquote $400 and something thousand mistake.
According to Mal, the $400K mistake was never fixed, they were never given updated accounts, and Joe said if he doesn't like it, they can audit him.
Where's the new one? And he was like, oh, y'all trying to paint me away, da-da-da. And I'm like, no, we just want the correct accounting. Oh, well then audit me then.
And it was at this point that Mal said that he realized Joe had changed. Well, it was the accounting and the funny hats.
And I told you this, I said, fam, I'm not even sure who this nigga is anymore. I never seen a nigga wear a Mary hat in my life.
Meanwhile, on the same day as Rory and Mal's defense dropped, seemingly as a coincidence, also on the 15th of May, Joe had released episode 438 of his podcast, where he backtracked a few of the things that he had said in the heated on-air firing in the previous episode, essentially saying he owed Rory an apology. Joe even brought his therapist on the show and pondered for an extended period of time whether he'd handled certain things wrong and what he could learn from the situation. I personally don't think there was too much value to this podcast, and what was done is done. But again, if you want to hear that in its full, go check out Joe Budden's Patreon or whatever. Anywho, once Joe had realized that Rory and Mal had released a response that day, after giving it a watch in full, Joe then went live, responding to the points made in Rory and Mal's podcast, as well as some of the hate surrounding it.
You ill, fam. You not for the creators. Oh my God, look what they're saying. They were really, really honest. They were. It's my guys, though. I love them. Joe's not suing nobody. I don't have time to sue anybody.
Joe completely denied the accusation of a $400K accounting error.
No accountant made a $400,000 mistake, man. Wow. These brothers just took 2 seconds to stop thinking that Joe was a bad guy and just looked at the 5 years of accounting that was sent over, man. You do me a favor. You go to your job tomorrow and you tell the accounting team how to run the accounting. Let me know how it works out for you. $400,000, man. That's just how Spotify paid us out. $400,000 payout that was paid out, prorated.
I'll be honest, some of the funniest shit from this live was people jumping in the comments making suggestions on what Joe Budden could have possibly spent 400 racks on.
$400,000 on dad hats. That's a lot of dad hats, man. It's a lot of dad hats.
The comments on this video were telling. Right, I forgot to say that Joe also went live again a day after this, where he said a few new things, including that Rory and Mal weren't actually profit participants in their contract, and that they really just got a share of his net earnings.
It doesn't say that they are profit participants of the podcast. They make money off of my podcast earnings net.
Now, net is the important word here because Joe went on to say that he learned during his Spotify deal that he was spending way too much money on running his podcasting business.
And after the Spotify deal, I quickly learned that I was all wrong. I ain't never had no money, so it was costing me a lot more. It was expensive.
Joe went on to say that he put money from his other deals back into his business, and he was suggesting that he had overpaid Rory and Mal during this period, suggesting that if he'd have paid them out net, like his contract said he should, they would have only been entitled to around $30K.
And I ran the business. My Revolt money, my pull-up money, my Love and Hip Hop money, YouTube money, any money. Any money I had, I came back and put it all in the business. Because if I didn't do that, niggas might be making $30,000 and $40,000 based on a contract. That ain't the friendly thing to do. Watch your niggas make 40, and that's nasty. So I never honored it.
In the end, Joe said he didn't honor that original agreement and that he chose to overpay Rory and Mal.
Always just went above and beyond. They don't know that I'm going above and beyond. They don't know I'm taking money from all over the place to make sure everybody's okay. They don't know.
And this was of course accompanied by Andrew Schulz clowning Rory and Mal, saying their solo episode was boring and that he's the new producer for Rory's podcast.
Big announcement. I am the producer of the new Rory and Mal podcast coming to the White Effect Network. I tried listening to their episode, and for the good of the public, I think what we'll do is record episodes with them, but just never release them so nobody has to be that bored for an extended period of time again.
So basically, Joe saw Rory and Mal's response, denied running off on the plug with $400K, suggesting that was just leftover money from the Spotify deal, and he kept it moving. Unfortunately for Joe, there was another scandal waiting just around the corner. After Joe's on-air firing of Rory did the rounds on social media, people start piling in to diss Joe Budden. This included everyone's favourite little pint-sized arena seller-outer Kevin Hart.
To see you publicly shit on the guys that was with you, that's an example of poor leadership. That's an example of why you are where you are.
But just when it seemed like public sentiment on Joe couldn't get any worse, Joe gets hit with a sexual misconduct allegation from a former cast member on one of his female-focused podcasts, Olivia Dope. These allegations certainly dashed any hopes of Joe Budden's female-focused network being acquired by a super woke company like Spotify bought Gimlet, and that $100 million check basically evaporated before Joe's very eyes. And for some people, Joe's apology wasn't cutting it either. Joe initially came out to atone for his wrongdoings in a statement issued via Rolling Stone, which said, "As a podcaster, it's my job to address topics and create dialogue around them. During the conversation on See the Thing Is podcast, I didn't handle the topics with the sensitivity they deserved. I recognize my words and power in that situation created an upsetting environment for Olivia. Upon reflection, both the network and I take accountability for this. I apologize sincerely to Olivia, her former co-hosts, our staff, and the public. In an effort to not further any trauma, the episode will be removed from all platforms. We support all women's right to feel comfortable and protected in the workplace. We fell short of that in this instance. We support Olivia in her quest to heal, applaud her for finding the strength to share her experience, and wish her the best in all her future endeavors. I am taking the time to listen and learn. We have already begun to make the necessary changes to ensure this is a safe environment for all moving forward. We at the network endeavor to continue to elevate black women's voices and create opportunities to have constructive conversations to impact change." Now look, some people thought that that was one of those fake apologies where they just used a whole bunch of words to dance around what really happened and not really apologize. Joe did apologise in there. It was a bit wordy. He probably could have done it in less words so that people felt the apology was a bit more clear and sincere. But anyway, at this point, Joe decided to stop hiding behind his Patreon and make a full return to YouTube podcasting, uploading episode 439 on the Joe Budden TV channel, but notably missing his regular sponsor Cash App, and joined by Ish, Ice, and a whole lot of dislikes. In that episode of the podcast, he once again made an apology to Olivia Dope for the way that he had handled things, defended his intentions to provide an entertaining atmosphere on the podcast, but admitted to lowering the tones. Again, some people didn't feel like this apology cut it, but at the same time, what's done is done. Joe apologized, and I hope he's learned his lesson. Also in this podcast episode, Joe went on to react to Kevin Hart's comments about him and essentially took full responsibility for his failures in leadership recently.
You had one common goal, which was to get your team somewhere, and you didn't do it. You failed.
And for the record, I thought that was quite a decent thing to say. What's done is done. Joe can't make up for the problems that he's had on the podcast with his co-hosts. But hell, it does seem like he has actually learned something from this experience. And hey, hopefully, he might have better relationships with people going forward. I don't know. But you know what? It wasn't a complete loss for Rory and Mal either. A little while after the dust had settled on the breakup, they launched their own YouTube channel and dropped an unexpectedly good sketch called The Job Hunt. It was kind of a live-action, dramatized sketch where they played themselves going to a job interview. It had some like pretty heavy Dave Atlanta kind of vibes with it. It's pretty cool, not really sure where they're gonna go with it, but hey, good stuff. Joe Budden was even heard in a new episode alongside Ish that he was happy for his former co-hosts in their new venture.
I'm happy for Rory and Mal.
Okay. I like the clip they
that
put
clip
out.
was, I'm happy.
Let me tell you.
And so from here, Joe Budden would continue podcasting without his usual stooges. And sure, some of Joe's stooge supporting fans begun to turn on him, jumping ship to the Rory and Mal bandwagon. And yes, his own subreddit was dissing him pretty heavily during this period, and seemingly bigging up Rory and Mal for their new project any opportunity they could. Hell, this got to the point where even DJ Academics was dissing Joe's own fans for turning on him.
It would have never, in my wildest dreams, I never would have thought that Joe Budden's own fan base would have switched sides on him and brought them back to life.
As of June the 12th, 2021, Rory and Mal debuted the first episode of their own solo podcast, New Rory and Mal, available on Spotify of all places, and with the video version of the podcast running up hundreds of thousands of views within its first few days of upload. And thankfully, the comments are overwhelmingly supportive of Rory and Mal's new setup. If I've learned anything from this story, it's that Joe Budden is truly a flawed genius. He's a microphone mastermind, whether it's rapping bars or podding cast. With just his brain and his mouth, Joe Budden can single-handedly conjure up hours of pleasure, pause. But the reality is, Joe Budden is clearly awful to work with. Hell, his tendency to fall out with people and get into bitter feuds and disagreements has probably been the most prominent aspect of his entire career. And I think, as harsh as it is to say this, Rory and Mal kind of screwed up the most here. They weren't there for the founding of the podcast. Rory came in after a handful of episodes, and Mal came in after more than 70. They didn't create the podcast. They witnessed Joe firing Marisa like an employee, kind of unreasonably, and they let Joe rename the podcast when it was already doing well, the Joe Budden Podcast. I know they thought they were profit partners, and maybe they were, but Charlemagne told them everything they needed to know about doing business with Joe in episode 113. And then they witnessed Joe fall out of bed with everyday struggle 6 months later, exactly when Charlemagne said he would. And they still put their trust in Joe. They didn't build anything of their own, holding out for a share in a big check they thought they'd be getting but were never really entitled to. And they failed to have the foresight to realize that turning down a massive industry check and then booting out his day one homies is the exact sort of thing that Joe Budden would do. And then not showing up to record the podcast with a lot of money on the line is the exact sort of thing that Joe Budden would flip out on you over to. I know this drama was a huge disappointment to many fans, but to many people, this is exactly what we knew was coming. Joe Budden's life is one filled with twists and turns and drama, and realistically, don't we all really just want to tune into Joe Budden, winding people up, wiling out, and then walking off? Let's be real, as the podcast was collapsing and the co-hosts were feuding, the numbers had never been so good. And now Rory and Mal have launched a pretty popping solo podcasting career off the back of this drama. Meanwhile, Joe Budden has moved forward with the entire ownership of his network as a free agent. Admittedly, a few fans later, and sure, it might take Joe Budden a little bit of time to win back some of the fans he lost, but I have no doubt he will, because the power of his personality is unstoppable. But whether or not he could ever be friends with Rory and Mal again, I don't know. But I do know one thing for sure. If they do ever reunite together, you know for a fact there is going to be a big bag on the table, and Joe's taking all of it. Hope you enjoyed that one. Thanks for watching. Until next time, peace. Oh, hey guys, it's your boy, still here. Thank you so much to all of the Patreons who you can see on screen over there right now. I really appreciate your support. Anybody wants to support this channel going forward to get their name in the credits, head on over to patreon.com/TraplawRoss and show some love there, baby. Show some love. Or if you don't want to join Patreon, you just want to show some love and connect with me a little bit closer, head on over to my second channel, Trap More Ross, where I'm uploading much more regularly, much more casually. It's a vibe, it's lit. Thanks to everyone that's been supporting. It's your boy, bye.